Russia does not recognize World War II as starting in 1939, but rather the period between 1941 and 1945, which was after the beginning of the Axis invasion of Soviet territory, and they do not call it World War II, but rather, examining the way the Great Patriotic War is portrayed in Russian national history books seems reasonable, since special attention is given in the Russian Federation to what Russians call native history, or indigenous history. A direct effect of this attachment to the history of the Russian state is that more hours are dedicated to the study of national history than to world general history. Russian historians also more frequently focus on internal problems during the USSR era than on the relationships between the Soviet state and other countries. As for the Holocaust, there is a need in Russia to convey comprehensive knowledge about the history of this sensitive topic to younger generations. This need is dictated by the crisis in public consciousness in Russia, the rise of nationalism and extremist views, the increase in political anti-Semitism, and the denial of the Holocaust. According to information provided by the Anti-Fascist Center in Moscow, Russia has more than 40 radical organizations, including 16 with highly extremist orientations. The largest of these is the Russian National Union, RNU, with a membership between 150,000 and 200,000. National and political extremism leads to open acts of terrorism. Many non-Russian ethnic groups, Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Georgians, and others, are constantly harassed. Today, we'll dive deeper into how Russian schools teach World War II and the Holocaust. It is very clear in textbooks that the memory of selected events and figures from the Russian state's past is exaggerated and embellished. However, shaping a completely false collective memory is very difficult, whereas it is much easier to inflate certain fragments of history to the size of an important myth for the group. One example of this is World War II, the founding myth, which consists of many minor triumphs, e.g. the Battle of Stalingrad, and myths, e.g. the myth of the soldier liberator. Each of these is portrayed, on the one hand, as a separate event, and on the other, as a component of the USSR's victory over the Nazi enemy. World War II is immovably frozen and sacralized as the foundation of school historiography. When talking about 1941 to 1945, therefore, we are faced with a heroic narrative, highlighting the Soviet state's military successes while ignoring its setbacks and defeats. The axis around which the image of World War II is built is success. And there is nothing strange about that, since the Russian authorities are aware that belief in past victories unifies the nation in a sense of pride and satisfaction in its superiority over the real or imagined enemy. Therefore, when there is no basis to speak of triumph, the rulers can transform any defeat into a victory of the Soviet nation, the Red Army, or the military industry. Thus, in the context of World War II, the term defeat is virtually non-existent. In textbooks, the victory over Hitler's Germany is emphasized at nearly every step. In the description of the defense of the capital, the Battle of Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk, or the Siege of Leningrad. Let's take the defense of Stalingrad. Textbooks emphasize that it was a success of the Red Army and a decisive event not only in WW2, but in the entirety of World War II. In most history books, minor successful events compose the image of the city's defense, such as the 58-day defense of Pavlov's house and the clashes at Mamayev Kurgan, one of the main strategic points of the battle. The books emphasize Operation Uranus, a Soviet counteroffensive in November 1942, which resulted in the encirclement and surrender of General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army. The emphasis is that the Red Army's success in Stalingrad strengthened the Soviet nation's faith in victory. The Battle of Kursk is portrayed similarly, with emphasis on the Red Army's resistance to the powerful German attack and the Germans' failure to achieve their expected outcomes. Much of the textbooks describe the Battle of Prokhorovka as the largest tank battle of World War II, even without explicitly using the terms victory or success, opting to state that the Germans were forced onto the defensive or retreated to their initial positions. It is also emphasized that the Battle of Kursk undermined the German tank and air power, resulting in the Wehrmacht's loss of strategic initiative, together with the Soviet offensive in left bank Ukraine. The Soviet state's minor successes culminate in victory in 1945 with the surrender of Germany and Japan. The books go into detail about the Berlin operation in April 1945, conducted by the 1st and 2nd Belarusian fronts and the 1st Ukrainian front on the Eastern Front. It is highlighted that the Red Army's strength did not lie in the number of soldiers or their combat experience, but in the patriotic spirit among the fighters. The books also describe the battle for the Reichstag and the symbolic placement of a red flag over the Reich Parliament by 2 Soviet soldiers on April 30th. Nearly 100% of the books highlight the German surrender on May 2nd, 1945, the signing of the Third Reich's Act of Capitulation on May 8-9, 1945, and the designation of May 9th as Victory Day. In addition to Germany's defeat, the USSR's victory in the Great Patriotic War is also over Japan, with the signing of the Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. In the book The History of Russia by Anatoly Torkanov, one of the main textbooks used, the USSR's victory in World War II represents the collapse of dictatorial regimes. Torkanov highlights that the defeat of Nazi Germany and Japan increased the authority of the Soviet state, turning it into a superpower. Furthermore, he emphasizes that the triumph of the Soviet nation in the bloodiest and cruelest war in human history was the most important event for the Russian state. The books explicitly highlight that the USSR's triumph in the war was possible, in part, due to the spiritual and patriotic support of the Soviet nation, which continued to believe in a final victory throughout the war. With success as the central pillar of the image of the Great Patriotic War, defeat is practically ignored. It is only mentioned when describing the activities of Germany, the USSR's main enemy in the war, always portraying the USSR's success as Germany's defeat. Although Torkanov directly discusses Soviet military setbacks, he portrays these events as inevitable due to Germany's advantage in numbers, technical equipment, experience, and qualified commanders. The books highlight examples of turning defeat into triumph, such as the heroic defense of Sevastopol in 1942, where despite the Red Army's defeat, the narrative emphasizes the heroic defense of the city and the Kerch Peninsula for 250 days. Many teachers and educational authorities have a serious interest in addressing the history of the Holocaust. For many years, the Holocaust was considered almost a taboo in history education. Official Soviet propaganda considered Jews only as one of the target groups of Nazi repression and did not mention them among the victims, or if it did, only in passing. To cite the very popular textbook on 20th century Russian history by A. Danilov and L. Kosulina, a final objective of the war was the destruction of the Soviet Union as a state and the transformation of conquered territories into a mere colonial appendage of the Third Reich, the physical annihilation of millions of people. A particular issue was the General Plan East, under which 140 million Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, Lithuanians were to be deported and annihilated. Nothing is mentioned about the fate of Soviet Jews in the Nazi plans. Under the title, "Everything for the Motherland, Everything for Victory," A separate section is dedicated to the partisans behind enemy lines. It briefly describes the occupation regime in the conquered areas of the USSR. To break the Soviet people, the Nazis established a policy of bloody terror in the conquered regions according to the General Plan East. They killed and transferred several million Soviet citizens into fascist servitude. In the occupied areas, they used forced labor, which was, in fact, slavery. Everywhere, there were concentration camps. Again, nothing is mentioned about the fate of Soviet Jews, or the attempts of partisan groups to save Jews from annihilation. Why Soviet textbooks never mentioned the Holocaust as a genocide committed by the Nazis against the Jews? The first reason is that, immediately after World War II, Jews were also persecuted by the Soviet regime, and anti-Semitism officially existed in the USSR until the end of the communist era. The second reason is that many ethnic groups, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, Turks, Greeks, Koreans, and many others, were also persecuted, and for many of these nations, the persecution also involved genocide. Both reasons are still relevant, even though anti-Semitism is no longer an official policy. Currently, many Jews hold high positions in government administration, mass media, and business. Jewish communities in Russia and Ukraine are strong and powerful. However, anti-Semitism remains popular among ordinary people. Many applaud anti-Semitic speeches by General Makashov, a member of the Russian parliament, or support the previously mentioned Russian National Union and its military organization. They believe in a global Jewish conspiracy. Most of the media and the general public prefer tribal or nationalist values over universal values. Showing solidarity with Slavic Serbs or Orthodox Christians seemed to be more important than respecting human rights or demonstrating intolerance for genocide. This is why the topics of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and moral responsibility in a civilized society are truly vital for Russia. History is taught in two different courses in Russian schools: General History and Russian History. Some schools offer special courses. For example, all Jewish schools have a special Jewish history course. In many regions, a local history course is required. However, most schools place more emphasis on Russian history. 20th century history is generally taught in the lower secondary school and the upper secondary school. As a rule, the lower secondary school history course focuses on facts and events, while upper secondary school courses place greater weight on ideas, personalities, and theoretical approaches to major development trends. This two-tier system was established only recently. Some schools still have a linear course and do not deal with 20th century history in the 9th grade. Two different levels of study require two different series of textbooks, one for lower secondary and one for upper secondary school. In practice, this difference does not play a dominant role. Many textbooks intended for upper secondary are also used in the 9th grade. There is a dispute about which course should include the Holocaust. The major events related to this topic did not occur on Russian or Soviet territory. The main extermination and concentration camps were located in Poland. Not many ghettos were established on Soviet territory. This would support the view that the Holocaust should be taught during general history classes. On the other hand, the German occupation of Soviet territory included a policy of exterminating the Jewish population. Therefore, examples from local history could be integrated into the Holocaust course. The topic would then be more appropriate for Russian history courses. The entire topic of World War II is, in many cases, untouchable in Russian schools. The Soviet-German War is still treated as the Great Patriotic War, a theme of national pride where all controversial issues are set aside. the price paid for victory, the mistakes made by Stalin, the headquarters and generals, the massive human losses, and the persecution by a totalitarian state are generally not discussed in the classroom. Therefore, it is more likely to find more information, if any, related to the Holocaust in general history courses. The term Holocaust, the concepts of genocide, collapse of European Jewry, official anti-Semitic policy, and so forth are normally omitted from the minimum mandatory curriculum for historical education. Seen in this context, it is not so surprising that only one textbook was found to give considerable attention to the issues mentioned above. Most textbooks on Russian history follow a traditional approach in explaining the topic. The new order established by the Nazis is characterized, first and foremost, as a policy of enslaving the Slavic people, without describing the position of the Jewish population in detail. The texts do not refer to the anti-Semitic propaganda of the German occupation authorities, which aimed to separate the Jews from the majority population. In explaining the Nazi economic program, the authors deal with the policy of Aryanization, that is, the expropriation of Jewish property, but they do not take into account the anti-Jewish elements of Nazi philosophy and policy. For example, the Nuremberg Laws, persecution of Jewish culture, Kristallnacht, the creation of concentration camps, and the exile of Jews. In chapters on World War II, genocide is mentioned only briefly as something planned and executed in the occupied countries. Before the attack on the USSR, the invaders established special extermination camps, where the undesirable population, primarily Jews and Slavs, would be killed. Thus, the number of Holocaust victims is not emphasized and gets lost in general statistics. The resistance of prisoners in ghettos and extermination camps is also omitted. For example, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, demolition by prisoners at the Sobibor extermination camp, and so on. Nothing is said about the so-called righteous among the nations, who were people that saved Jews from extinction. When speaking about the Nuremberg trials, there is likewise no assessment of the genocide against Jews, Roma, and Slavs. The Holocaust took place mainly in the regions of Ukraine and Belarus, where most of the USSR's Jewish population lived before the war. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, new national history courses were established in the former republics. It is particularly evident in Ukraine that the authors of new textbooks tried to establish their own approach, different from the Russian one, to national history. The book by S. Kulchitsky and Kurnosov, intended for 10th grade students with Russian as their native language, highlights that the main objective of the occupation regime was the colonization of Ukraine. It is emphasized that the Nazis wanted to ensure that people of pure German blood lived in the East. There are some new trends in the presentation of Holocaust issues in history textbooks. A. Kreeder wrote one of the best textbooks on 20th century history. It is possible to see what makes the difference. Section 4. The Turbulent 30s contains a paragraph on fascism in Germany, in which the main features of National Socialism are presented: nationalism, totalitarianism, violence, populism, anti-democratic attitudes, and anti-Semitism. The book emphasizes that anti-Semitism became the official policy of the fascist state. In 1933, the German authorities began a boycott of all Jewish-owned businesses. In 1935, a series of laws were adopted, depriving Jews of German citizenship and prohibiting them from holding any official state positions. Interracial marriages were forbidden. In 1939, all Jews began to be moved into ghettos. They were not allowed to enter public places, participate in various activities, and were forced to wear a yellow star on their clothes at all times. On the night of November 9, 1938, the authorities organized a pogrom against tens of thousands of Jews. Thus, the political foundations for the extermination of Jews during the war were laid. 6 million Jews became victims of the Nazis' racial madness. On the pages dedicated to World War II, Hitler's anti-Semitic policy is repeatedly emphasized. The paragraph on the resistance movement highlights that one of the reasons for the resistance was the German occupation authorities began to implement a racial policy of exterminating uncivilized peoples. European Jews and Roma and the Slavic population of Eastern Europe became victims of this policy. Concentration camps were established throughout Europe. In total, 18 million people were imprisoned in concentration camps, and 12 million of them were exterminated. In other words, in short, the Nazi policy toward Slavs is characterized as genocide, and toward Jews as the true catastrophe. The year 1939 almost does not exist in the historical consciousness of Russians. The years 1939 to 1941 represent a territorially limited conflict for them. The date of Nazi Germany's aggression against the USSR and the beginning of the Great Patriotic War on June 22, 1941, remains a crucial moment for Russian historiography. This is also observed in national Russian history textbooks. The image of the Great Patriotic War created in them consists of a series of military victories, a joint struggle of all Soviet nations against the enemy, heroism, and sacrifice. Defeat is rarely mentioned, at least not in the context of setbacks for the Soviet state. The elements used to describe the siege of Leningrad are clearly visible, including the sacrifice of the Soviet nation for the motherland and the belief in victory over the enemy. In Russia, the officials and politicians responsible for developing the school curriculum are the decision-makers on the content of textbooks. The selection of historical material is done at the ministerial level. On one hand, the implementation of the concept, and on the other, the formation of the mandatory view of the Great Patriotic War in schools constitute an excellent example of how the Russian state's historical policy is shaped. It is natural for textbooks to build historical awareness primarily on clearly positive events and figures, or to effectively ignore those whose morally ambiguous choices are debatable. Despite the mnemonic field of the Russian Federation being very broad, also encompassing the revolutions of 1917, the Empire of Peter the Great, or the year 1612, to name a few, Victory Day, celebrated on May 9th, is considered by Russians as one of their main holidays, right after New Year, their own birthdays, and those of their loved ones. Additionally, about 85% of Russians have war veterans in their families, while 68% are relatives of someone who died during the war. The impact of the Great Patriotic War myth is, therefore, enormous. This partly explains the gradual return to the cult of Stalin, the criminalization of historical lies, and the introduction of textbooks that present a uniform interpretation of history in schools. By examining the standardization of history teaching in schools and the functioning of the Great Patriotic War myth in Russian society, one can conclude that such measures are part of a larger framework, a complex of deliberate efforts by Russian authorities to mold Russians into citizens who, believing in shared ideals, will be ready to defend the motherland at any time, just as their ancestors did during the Great Patriotic War.